en 5 segundos. Y yo les aviso. Okay, we are live. Thank you everyone for joining. We're gonna take a few minutes, 2 to 3 minutes for people to start coming in. Please share this Facebook Live with your friends, with your networks, so we can get more people to join in. We'll wait 1, 2, 3 minutes maximum to start with this panel. Thank you. And while we're getting people to join in, I just want to mention we're going to have this event is going to be on English, but we're going to have a Spanish translation that is going to be happening simultaneously. So there is the Zoom link for a Zoom channel where you can hear the Spanish translation. You can find that link on the Facebook event, and we're going to post it also here on the Facebook Live. So we should start in about 1 minute. Okay, so I think I'm going to start with just like a brief welcome introduction, and then we'll get people joining in as we move from the introduction to the panel. So welcome everyone again. My name is Edil Sepúlveda, and I'm the co-founder of Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, and based here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining today's special panel on finding consensus for a serious self-determination and decolonization process for Puerto Rico. Before moving along, and as I just mentioned, we're having a simultaneous Spanish translation through a separate Zoom channel, and you can find the link on the Facebook event or here in the chat in the Facebook Live. We'll post it in just a bit. Le queríamos indicar que tenemos traducción simultánea al español por un canal separado de Zoom y pueden encontrar el link en el Facebook event o lo colocaremos aquí en el chat del Facebook Live prontamente. Now I would like to start by thanking our panelists for their time and availability for joining today's special panel on the political status of Puerto Rico. Also thank our amazing team at Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, including Luis Ponce in Colorado, Daniel Velazquez in Virginia, and Carol Velandia and her company, Equal Access Language Services, for the Spanish translation. Finally, also thanks to our ally organizations, Center for Popular Democracy, CPD Action, the Hedge Clippers, Philly Boricuas, Diáspora en Resistencia, and Vamos Puerto Rico, and our many other collaborators throughout the diaspora and on the island for their help promoting the event and for raising awareness about the importance of solving the political status issue of Puerto Rico once and for all. As some of you already know, we hosted the first virtual Puerto Rican Diaspora Activism Summit last week with the support, collaboration, and co-sponsorship of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian Latino Center, and the University of Puerto Rico in Cayey. We decided to postpone this panel for today to avoid any unnecessary trouble or misunderstanding of what turned out to be a very successful two-day summit that focused on grassroots efforts to help with Puerto Rico's recent recovery and reconstruction efforts. Nevertheless, some lobbyists and some high-profile politicians, like former Governor of Puerto Rico, Luis Fortuño, tried unsuccessfully to censor and to silence the voices that usually are not heard here in Washington. For the past 4 years, our organization has focused on connecting the voices of Puerto Ricans, both on the island and throughout the diaspora, with decision makers here in Washington. And there is no issue more important for Puerto Ricans than that of the political status of Puerto Rico. Our goal with today's event is that the American people have the opportunity to hear different voices directly from the island, describing the colonial problem of Puerto Rico. Voices that have been silenced and invisibilized here in Washington by those same ones that tried to silence and invisibilize us last week during the summit. Our focus, and this is very important, our focus, as the title of the panel indicates, is on two things: consensus and process. Finding a consensus for a serious self-determination process. The end goal is that we can end this shameful colonial status of Puerto Rico altogether. So with that in mind, we have invited for today's event a dream team. I call this a dream team of Puerto Ricans that are very knowledgeable about the political status question. First, we have Carmen Yulín Cruz. She's the former mayor of the capital of Puerto Rico, San Juan, and she was also co-chair of the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign. Second, we have Juan Dalmau Ramirez. He's a former senator and a former candidate for governor of Puerto Rico, who just had a historic result in the recent general elections in Puerto Rico, obtaining the highest electoral support for the Puerto Rican Independence Party in almost 70 years. He's arguably one of the most charismatic and popular politicians in Puerto Rico today, with his motto, Patria Nueva. Next, we have Senator Rafael Bernawe. He was recently elected a senator at large for the newly founded Citizens Victory Movement, a professor for many years at the University of Puerto Rico, and a former candidate for governor for the Working People's Party of Puerto Rico. Last but not least, we have Luis Gutierrez, a former U.S. representative for Illinois' 4th Congressional District from 1993 to 2019. Before that, he served as a member of the Chicago City Council, and now he's enjoying life on the island of Puerto Rico. So thank you all of you for joining. We're now on the gallery view. So the format for today. So we're gonna have first, we're gonna show a pre-recorded video of Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez. She has a very busy schedule, but she managed to record a video to talk about the colonial problem in Puerto Rico. And then after that, we're gonna go into the panel. We're gonna have 2 interventions of around 5 minutes each. And then after that, we'll just have a moderated conversation with the panelists, and we're gonna be addressing the questions that are coming from you, from all of you. So as you're watching the panel, please post your questions on the Facebook live chat, and we're gonna be addressing those. We're gonna leave at least 20 to 25 minutes at the end of the moderated conversation, so we can address those questions. Also, I want to indicate that we have Renata Beca. She is the staffer for Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez, the staffer on the, among other topics, the topic of Puerto Rico for the Congresswoman. So she is gonna be available in the Q&A session to address any question that is addressed to Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez. So with that, we are gonna go first to the video from Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez. Share the screen here.
Good afternoon. I'm Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez from New York's 7th Congressional District. I would like to first congratulate and thank the organizers of today's first Puerto Rican Diaspora Activism Summit. When we talk about the political future of the island, we must start by recognizing that over a century ago, the United States invaded Puerto Rico. And ever since, the US has pursued its own colonial rule. I think many of us can agree, regardless of our own personal opinion, that the current territorial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico needs to be rigorously scrutinized. So, what I proposed last Congress, alongside my colleague, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and will be reintroducing in the coming weeks, is a solution to the status question that will empower Puerto Ricans to determine their own political future. The Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act will prompt Puerto Rico's legislature to create a status convention whose delegates will be elected by Puerto Rican voters. This body will develop a long-term solution for Puerto Rico's status, be that statehood, independence, free association, or any other option than the current territorial arrangement. Because I strongly believe that decisions should come from those who will be impacted most, and that is the people of Puerto Rico. If Puerto Rico is to chart its own course, the process must come from the bottom up, not the top down. So please do not hesitate to reach out to my office for more information. I look forward to working with you all to hear your ideas, your feedback, and your vision for a brighter future for the island we all deeply love. Thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I hope the summit is a productive and rich exchange of ideas.
So now this is a good segue to start the panel. And as I mentioned, you can be posting your questions, and we have the staff of Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez, who is going to be addressing also questions directed towards her during the Q&A session. So most Americans here in the United States, they learn about Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And Puerto Ricans have suffered many tragedies and many disasters in the recent years, but we have also been facing an economic crisis for many years now. So the question at hand first for the panel in this first intervention is the political status and the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States the culprit, the responsible of our economic and social precarity? And if so, what do you propose as the path forward to solve our most urgent problems in Puerto Rico? So we're gonna move first with Carmen Yulín for the start of the panel. Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you very much, everybody. And I'm very happy to be here with Juan and Rafa, and of course, Congressman Luis Gutierrez. I think the simple answer is yes. Many of the problems that Puerto Rico faces today have to do with our colonial status. And many of the plans to get out of the economic rut have to do with ensuring that Puerto Rico meets its expectations in the world stage. But I want to digress a little bit before, because there are people in Puerto Rico that still think that the current Commonwealth political status is not a colonial status. I think that more than thinking, they know that Puerto Rico is a colony, but because of a number of issues, they don't want to face reality. And they talk about an enhanced Commonwealth. I have been a member of the Popular Democratic Party for many years, but I myself support free association. Why? Number one, because every country has a right to be free. When you put boots on the ground and you invade another nation, and this is very important for people to understand, Puerto Rico is a nation with its own cultural identity. When you put boots on the ground and you invade a nation and you let somebody else in another land make everyday decisions for our lives, that is the very definition of what a colonial status is. And you talked about Hurricane Irma and Maria. Just to give our listeners an example, in Puerto Rico, we were not allowed to buy generators nor lampposts, ni posta ni generadores, from any other country but the US. Now, because the US had been facing some problems in Texas and other areas, there were none available. If we had been either independent or free associated state, we could have engaged in a relationship with other countries that were trying to help Puerto Rico. But because of Donald Trump and his inefficacy and his discriminatory practices, which are allowed because we are a colony of the United States, we were unable to take care of ourselves and speed up the recovery. So there is no question in anybody's mind that the current territorial status is not an honorable status. It may have had its good and progressive stage at some point, but it is not there anymore, and it does not represent the aspirations and the needs of the Puerto Rican people. So with that said, then what process would be the best process? Again, and for those that are listening, I know that the DC statehood and Puerto Rico statehood issue are being tried to put as if they were both the same, but they're not. DC is a human civil rights issue. Puerto Rico is a human rights issue. Again, we are a nation which was invaded. Thus, it falls upon us to deal with the issue of the shackles of the lack of freedom in Puerto Rico to ensure that we have a better future for ourselves. In my case, I believe in a joint relationship with the United States. So that self-determination process, it's very important. And one of the things that I like about Representative Nidia Velazquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez bill is that, first of all, for the first time, it calls a spade. And it doesn't shy away from saying that the territorial status is a colonial status. And that is important for people in the United States to understand. Secondly, it is a binding process. No longer will we be voting and doing magical tricks that are going to be paraded in front of the American people as false majorities. And I'm sure that Juan was talking to us about the numbers and how the people that believe in statehood parade numbers which are inappropriate. But I'll give you just one. According to them, 92% of the people voted for statehood on the plebiscite of 2017. Now, 52%, according to them, voted. So that is a very steep drop in people's willingness to become a state. And the last thing that I'm going to say is that it imposes non-colonial solutions. We cannot try to fix a problem by, as part of the solutions, leaving the territorial status. If the Commonwealth is placed under federal jurisdiction, under congressional jurisdiction, under any trade jurisdiction, we would be changing masters, but we will continue to be slaves.
Thank you so much, Julene, for that first intervention. Very powerful. You also mentioned what Nidia Velazquez mentioned, that we are an occupied nation. So that's very important. And we know that many Americans here, they don't know, all of those facts or historic facts on that issue. So next we're going to have Juan Dalmau, and Juan, the question is the same. As I just mentioned.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I want to thank the organizers for this opportunity to participate with this distinguished panel in this important subject that it needs to be addressed in the U.S. Congress, and this is part of a great initiative to do that. So I thank you all for letting me be part of it and have this discussion. I think Julene summarized so well most of the aspects that I was gonna cover. So I have the opportunity now just to emphasize on some of the things that she said and that Congresswoman Velazquez addressed. First of all, being in Black History Month, I think the phrase that was used by Malcolm X, that African Americans didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on African Americans, is applied here perfectly, because as Julene said, we didn't invade the United States. Puerto Rico was a trophy of the Hispanic American War that the United States needed for geopolitical and economic strategic purposes. So after the invasion of Puerto Rico, we had a military government for 2 years. And then after that, we have different civil governments, all of them by virtue of congressional law, based on the constitutional construction that Puerto Rico, in terms of the US Constitution, is not part of the United States, but belongs to the United States. And that's part of the constitutional and judicial colonial structure that has been constructed to justify, well, first of all, the Foraker Act in 1900, then the Jones Act in 1917, which applied to us, not only imposed to us the US citizenship, but also imposed to us cabotage laws, which is an economic burden for the Puerto Rican people. Then Public Law 600 that allowed Puerto Ricans to draft a constitution, but ultimately Congress was the one that was gonna approve or disapprove the draft of that constitution. And then Promesa, which is the new form of colonial government by an oversight board. So given those aspects, to your question, of course, the main problem economically, socially, politically, democratically is precisely our colonial problem, our territorial condition. So to your second question, well, what path should we take? Well, my party, the Puerto Rican Independence Party, has proposed.
Sorry, Juan, I think the audio, I think your headphones just disconnected. Can you?
Can you hear me?
Very vague.
Se oye bien bajito.
Sí, bien bajito.
What about now?
A little bit better, but still not the same as before.
This up.
Now that's perfect.
That's good.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, don't worry. So as I was saying, my party, the Puerto Rican Independence Party, believes that we should address the colonial problem with a decolonization convention or assembly. So the people of Puerto Rico could elect delegates that will address each of the options, but only non-colonial, non-territorial options to deal with the problem. The problem, which is the current territorial status, cannot be the solution to the problem of the territorial status. So I agree with Julene that that's something that Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez and Alexandria Ocasio address in their proposal that I agree with. First of all, they recognize the problem, which is a colonial problem in Puerto Rico. Second of all, they propose that the options that constitutional convention or assembly will debate and draft and deal with are going to be solutions to the problem. So there have to be options outside the territorial clause of the United States of America. And third, I think that that's something that the proposal of Nidia Velazquez has that is important is a bilateral committee which will make Congress engage with the delegates that will be elected by the Puerto Rican people. So there will be a dialogue of two parties. I mean, our natural right as a people, as a nation, is sovereignty, independence. We have to deal with the conditions of transition to that option. But other options will have to be negotiated, and it's more like a mutual determination. And that committee, that bilateral committee that the proposal of Nidia Velazquez includes, I think it's a step forward that guarantees that Congress cannot just say, well, first you have to put your act together in Puerto Rico and then you come to us. No, it's going to be something that they have to get hands-on the Puerto Rican status problem. So that's what I wanted to address as part of what Julene said. I just want to say something because I know that the audience may or possibly have misrepresentations or misconceptions of a couple of things. First of all, as Julene said, the problem of Puerto Rico is under international law, a case of human rights and self-determination. We are a people, we're a nation. Second of all, it's not a case of civil rights, as some of the new progressive party leaders have been saying. But ultimately, being a case of self-determination, the process that we had in the last election with the referendum, it's not real that the new progressive party is saying in Congress that, for example, I have the numbers here, only in the statehood yes or no referendum, statehood was favored by 52.5%, with only 53% of participation rate, which means that only 27% of eligible voters supported statehood. Only 32% of voters in Puerto Rico voted for the new progressive party pro-statehood governor, which is right now in Fortaleza. So I think they are making misrepresentations in Congress. As Julene said, in the last or the previous referendum in 2017, they said that they told Congress that they got a result of 97% of approval for statehood, but only 23% of registered voters voted in that referendum, which is the lowest in the history of any election or referendum on plebiscite in Puerto Rico. So I wanted to address those misrepresentations because I think they are trying to project or to present to Congress and to staffers a false statement that the majority of the people of Puerto Rico wants to become a state. That's not real, and I wanted to address that point. I know that later on I'll be able to answer all the questions, but again, grateful for being here and being part of this distinguished panel.
Thank you, Juan. And this is so good because we're having a different narrative to what we have been hearing the last couple of years here in Washington. That is the narrative of paid lobbyists by the statehood. And we heard that, specifically them talking to the congressional offices, that statehood obtained 97% of support of Puerto Ricans for many years. They were mentioning that. And you brought these numbers that the recent referendum in Puerto Rico in 2020, only 53% of participation. And for those that are joining from the United States and you're not familiar, usually in the past, historically, the referendums in Puerto Rico, and also the general elections, with the exception of the two last ones, the participation is around the 70% mark. So, you know, Puerto Ricans,
we like to vote. We like to vote.
Exactly, Puerto Ricans like to vote. So that tells you something when you're having just like 50% of the population going to vote. That is telling you something about the lack of democracy that the people of Puerto Rico are feeling. So I don't want to take more time into this. We're going to move to Rafael Bernawe to answer this first question for the first intervention of the panel. Thank you, Rafa.
Okay, I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Yes, let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this very important panel. In the interest of respecting the 5-minute time limit, I'm going to do something which I normally do not do, which is to read a brief presentation. So bear with me. Puerto Rico has been a colony of the United States since 1898. Colonialism has a political as well as an economic dimension. In 1900, Congress decreed free trade, or rather unrestricted trade, between Puerto Rico and the United States. Competition between economies of such unequal size and productivity levels led to results that have lasted to this day. For example, the invasion of Puerto Rico's market with imports from the United States, the one-sided specialization of its economy in productive activities required by the US market, the control by US capital of the main productive activities in Puerto Rico, the outflow of a considerable portion of the income and profits generated in Puerto Rico, the lack of employment for much of its labor force, the depressive impact of high unemployment on wages, high poverty rates compared to the United States, mass migration by the many people who cannot find employment in Puerto Rico, and the eligibility of many Puerto Ricans for federally funded welfare programs, which compensate for this dysfunctional colonial economy. Arguments for statehood, which I'm sure you have heard, are based on, one, the undeniable fact that living standards in Puerto Rico are considerably lower than those in the United States, and the faulty conclusion from that fact that making Puerto Rico a state would lift Puerto Rico to stateside levels of economic development. Puerto Rico's economic troubles, and this is the question that you addressed to us, Puerto Rico's economic troubles listed above are the result of unrestricted movement of goods, money, and capital over 120 years with the United States. Statehood would not alter these dispositions, but would rather fix Puerto Rico more firmly within them. Why would they now have an impact different from the results that they have had for more than a century? Since the early 1970s, after a period of convergence during the post-war boom, Puerto Rico's per capita income has been half of that of the poorest state, Mississippi. In over 50 years, half a century, this gap has remained intact. It has been argued that statehood would bring an increase in federal transfers to Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico already receives a very substantial amount of federal funds, which compensate for a dysfunctional colonial economy. Puerto Rico needs a functional economy, not palliatives for a dysfunctional one. Equipping Puerto Rico with an economy capable of guaranteeing its people adequate income and living standards is in the interest of the Puerto Rican people and the American people, who would no longer need to compensate for the failings of a colonial economy that only benefits a few corporations. This can be best achieved by the organization of the people of Puerto Rico as a democratic, independent republic, open to the fullest, mutually convenient collaboration with the United States, where, to begin with, a large, very large Puerto Rican diaspora resides. This fact cannot be ignored in any future organization of Puerto Rico's relations with the United States. Nor should the impact of colonial rule be ignored. The United States has a duty to support the reconstruction of Puerto Rico's economy, a duty which, as indicated, coincides with the interests of the American people. So, to summarize, yes, many of the key fundamental problems that we have are due to the present colonial relationship. And those aspects of the colonial relationship that generate these problems will not be altered by statehood. Statehood would perpetuate all of these conditions which have generated this problem. This is why I think that an independent Puerto Rico, in collaboration with the United States, would be best placed to address the problems that the existing relationship with the United States has generated. Now, what in the following question, in the following presentation, I will address the issue of what the process of self-determination should be like, and what I think about the Velazquez Ocasio-Cortez bill, and about the recent referendum that Carmen Yulín and Juan have already mentioned. I will address that in the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafa, and thank you for that, historical account. And just for the people to know, we are asking this question that I think is very important of, is the colonial relationship and the colonial status of Puerto Rico the culprit, the responsible of our economic, social, political problems? Because usually, and especially for Congress, it's so hard to move them, to solve one issue. And usually when we try to bring up, this topic of the status, it's always, we all know that it's a very sensitive topic, but they always try to not address that, and always kind of the answer is, okay, we do have more urgent problems, right? And that has been the answer for years and years and years and years. And it's always going to be the answer. There's always going to be more urgent problems. So I think it's important, and what the panelists today are, addressing, that historically, now for many decades, they have been going back to the 1900s. It has been the colonial relationship that we have, this territorial status, the kind of the root problem of all the issues that we have. And that's why it's so important to address it. And, we're looking forward, and this is kind of a parenthesis that we're doing here. We're looking forward for the chairman, Raul Grijalva, that is the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, to fulfill his promise to have a public hearing on this topic as soon as possible in the next coming months. So now we're going to move to Luis Gutierrez. You were a congressman for many, many years. You have the time now to address this question. And Luis, I think you have to unmute yourself and start your video.
I'm so sorry. I was being respectful to everyone else, so I muted and took myself off. I wanted to make sure that there weren't. Listen, thanks for the invitation. To me, it's a great honor and a privilege to share this stage. Carmen Yulín, she was a voice for Puerto Rico when the governor and the resident commissioner refused to challenge Donald Trump, refused to tell the story of what was happening. And I'll always be thankful to her for her many years of friendship and her commitment to public service and for standing up to Donald Trump, especially after Hurricane Maria. What can I say about Juan Dalmau? He's the first elected official ever in Puerto Rico I actually wrote a personal check to because I thought so much of his campaign. Actually, it was half and half from my wife and half from me. As Juan knows, she voted only for candidates of the Puerto Rican Independence Party. So Juan, thank you. And Senator Bernawe, wow, I was so happy when it was one of those surprises of the night that I didn't know that he would be elected a senator and go to the Senate. I know of his trajectory as a person who's fighting for working class people and against income inequality and for independence for Puerto Rico. And here I am on this virtual stage with the three of them, three people that I respect very much, and I am so happy I'm part of the political process here. Yes, colonialism is a sin against humanity, and they've been perpetuating it against the people of Puerto Rico now for over 120 years. And I would like everyone, after this is all over, and I hope you're recording it, just go back and look up Ley de la Mordaza. Go back and look up Cerro Maravilla. Go back and look up carpetas en Puerto Rico, y carpeteo en Puerto Rico. You can Google it. Why do I bring that up? Because there hasn't been democracy in Puerto Rico. When the independentistas were as strong as they have ever been, what did the government of Puerto Rico do? In connection with the FBI, the police department sought to destroy the Puerto Rican independence movement. That's not democracy, by having tens of thousands of people followed by these repressive agencies. Second, Ley de la Mordaza, my dad once told me he couldn't lift the Puerto Rican flag. This is 1948, when independence is strong and there's so much of the population. They say, hi, we don't want to hear from you. It's against the law to be for Puerto Rican independence. And last, Cerro Maravilla is an example, not the only one of many examples when state government terrorism has been used against those of us who fight for social and economic justice and for our independence. When 2 independentistas were murdered, assassinated, 4 policemen went to jail, were indicted and convicted of second-degree murder. There are many more cases. Why do I bring all of this up? Because I think it's important in the context that we understand that there have been huge sacrifices that have been made, lives that have been committed and lost to the struggle for freedom, for the struggle for justice in Puerto Rico. We live in an economy in which we produce what we do not consume and we consume what we do not produce. An economy of dependence in Puerto Rico. So yes, I want to take a moment to share 2 last things about colonialism. I was there when Promesa was put forward for a debate and a vote. I voted against Promesa. I'm not a great economist, but I could see. I thought of Gandhi. I thought of India. And I said to myself, wow, debt is colonialism. If you can put a people into such debt as they have done with the Junta de Control Fiscal, then maybe you don't need a standing army to control them because they are in debt. And we all know that debt is part, as was stated earlier, it is both a political and economic regime that they impose upon Puerto Rico. And the debt is part of that economic machine, and the political machine is part of the superstructure, which always is going against those of us who advocate independence for Puerto Rico. But I want to remind everybody that Democrats and Republicans share responsibility for the colonialism in Puerto Rico. Democrats for coming here, raising money, taking it back, and then making an alliance with the statehooders who do not share the values of the Democratic Party. Number 1, for Republicans coming here and doing it. I remember when Barack Obama didn't even spend the night here. He came in, collected his money, and got on the first plane out. No wonder he is now talking about maybe Puerto Rico should be a state of the union. You didn't spend the day here with us, Mr. Past President of the United States. So let's understand that during that debate of Promesa, I want to share with everybody. Do you know what was said to encourage people to vote? Hey, let's all vote for Promesa. It doesn't cost us a cent. Vote for Promesa, it's free. Vote for Promesa, we get rid of the problem and it doesn't cost the Treasury a cent. That is the way they deal with Puerto Rico at its moment of crisis. Zero. We're almost at $1 billion that have been paid to lawyers and accountants under this Junta de Control Fiscal. $1 billion at a moment of such necessity in Puerto Rico. That was the thing with PROMESA. And secondly, everybody knows that there's a rite of passage in the United States for every Puerto Rican that lives there. I passed it. I was a member of Congress. I went to Congress one day with my 2 daughters, with my daughter and my niece. And the security guard at the US Capitol wouldn't let me in even after I showed her my ID. I remember her so clearly snapping her fingers and saying, when I said, but I'm a member of Congress, I said very gently. And she said, I don't think so. And when it was proven to her that I was, you know what her response was? The rite of passage of every Puerto Rican. What is it? Why don't you just go back where you came from and we wouldn't have these problems with people like you? In other words, let me just be clear to all of those that want annexation and assimilation. That is the rite of passage of Puerto Ricans in the United States. And I want to make that absolutely clear to everybody that we should understand that this is a great moment, a wonderful moment. We are almost celebrating our own Arab Spring in Puerto Rico. That's how I looked at last summer and how I looked at these past elections. This is a great moment. I will, as Senator Bernawe says, I will now spend my second 5 minutes talking about Nidia Velazquez and the road forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis. So powerful. We're going to move to the second intervention, and then after that, we'll move directly to the questions from the audience because we're getting a lot of questions. But now, for the second intervention, there has been 6 plebiscites in Puerto Rico. In the last 10 years, 3 plebiscites organized, and I think the 2017 and the 2020 are the best example. There were plebiscites organized unilaterally by the new progressive party, the pro-statehood party in Puerto Rico. So they have not achieved anything in Puerto Rico, right? Because they are not, as many people see it, a serious process of self-determination and decolonization. So if we are looking for a serious process of self-determination and decolonization, can you tell us what elements are needed for that serious process? That's one. And then the second one that I think is very important because it's kind of like the call to action for the people that are watching. What can we do here in the diaspora, Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, that I think we're more than 5 million now? What can we do here to push for self-determination of Puerto Rico? And not only us, also our American allies, the congressional staffers that are watching, other American allies, what can they do to support the self-determination of Puerto Rico? So, Yulín, you can go first.
Yes, I want to touch on something that Luis just said, because it is a common misconception. People, for example, the governor of Puerto Rico right now calls himself a Democrat. Well, he is a dino, a Democrat in name only. And a lot of stateholders that call themselves Democrats, really, just like the past, the one that we ousted, Ricky Rosselló, really are Democrats in name only. When they govern in Puerto Rico, they govern with Republican mindsets. They govern with privatization of essential services mindsets, charter schools mindsets, taking away not only the wages of the public servants, but taking away services for public servants and people charging for public services. So that is very important to know. When they present themselves to you in the United States as, yo soy un republicano en Puerto Rico, pero soy un demócrata en los Estados Unidos, be very afraid and ask them really the nitty-gritty of what are the policies that they really support. Because when you look at them, they are taken out of the US Republican book of how to govern. That's number one. So don't let them fool you. Number two, I think Rafael Bernawe and Juan Dalmau and Luis Gutierrez all touch on one thing, this difference between justice and equality. Pro-statehooders continue to say it is an issue of equality. We are American citizens. They never say we are American citizens because the citizenship was pushed on us. We are American citizens. That does not make us Americans. If a person from Canada becomes a US citizen, they still continue to be Canadian. I am an American citizen, but I am a Puerto Rican national. Puerto Rico is my nation. My national identity is rooted in the Puerto Rican culture. That does not mean that I am better or worse than anyone in the United States, but it just means that you have to be very careful. Citizenship bestows upon you certain responsibilities and certain privileges. But when that citizenship was used, many historians say, as a way to get Puerto Ricans to fight on World War I, because there were fighting hands that needed to be there. It is important for the people in the United States to note that we feel, even though stateholders tell you that what they're looking for is la soberanía de Puerto Rico dentro de la soberanía de Estados Unidos, Puerto Rican sovereignty within the US sovereignty. So what they are telling the US, really without having the guts to say it, is that they want a nation, as they call us, to be part of another nation. So equality and justice are two different things. Equality is given everybody what they need. Justice is giving people what they deserve. And because we are a nation, we deserve a process of self-determination. And number three, I also wanted to say that we're not looking for handouts, and don't let it be fooled. I have to thank a lot of Democrats, Bernie Sanders, Benny Thompson, Raul Grijalva, Kirsten Gillibrand, Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey, Bill de Blasio, tons of Democrats all over the United States that stood up when they heard the voices in Puerto Rico that were clamoring and telling the truth about Donald Trump. But that does not give the US a solution of let's turn Puerto Ricans into a state just because it may be convenient for the Democratic Party. Just because supposedly there's going to be 2 senators, which are Democrats, and 4 or 5 members of the House of Representatives. So beware of all of these old maid's tales that the people that believe in statehood tell you about it. And one last thing that I want to make, why does the United States need to clean the blemish and the shame of colonialism? Luis mentioned a couple of examples. Agent Orange was tried in El Yunque, the only rainforest, as they call it in the United States National Park Service. It's our park. It's our park. The contraceptive pill was tried in Puerto Rico. The islands of Vieques and Culebra were bombarded for years, and there is a higher rate of patients with cancer in those islands. We have been submitted to the shackles of the financial domination and exploitation of the Jones Act. So to all the Americans that are listening, this is your time. This is your time to leave behind the blemish and the insult of the Trump administration. The American people don't want to have a colony. We don't want to be a colony. So this is your chance to stand up on the world stage and not only condemn other countries for what they're doing to their people, but look within yourselves and looking at what you have been doing to us. These are my two thoughts. But you know, Victoria, yeah, look at what the U.S. has been doing to us. Now, in our darkest time, 327 AFL-CIO workers left their homes without knowing us and came to San Juan, Puerto Rico to help. Let's use this time now, this new era, as an era of collaboration, as a springboard for democracy. As we, as in the world stage, develop a new democracy, a newmocracy, let us take the stain away, not only from the 3,000 Puerto Ricans that Donald Trump let die, but it is a moral imperative. A moral imperative, as well as what Rafael Bernawe just said. It is financially sound to have Puerto Rico have its own set of tools in order to be immersed in the world stage and carry our own set of solutions to our own set of problems.
Thank you, Yulin, for that. You're talking about collaboration between the American people and the Puerto Rican people. Juan, you have the stage now.
I'm going to take it where Yulin left it, because those misconceptions are very powerful still in the United States and still in the Democratic Party. Some people believe that the reparations for colonialism in Puerto Rico is an extension and assimilation. That's denying the dignity of sovereignty to the people of Puerto Rico, thinking that by becoming a state, then the damage of colonialism will be put to the past. In Puerto Rico, we call it the culmination of colonialism. It's like saying, and I think that this is critical, if you see the Puerto Rican problem, status problem, as a civil rights problem, you're gonna think that our problem is like when they let Rosa Parks sit in the front seat of the bus, where we want to drive our own bus. I understand why African Americans wanted to be treated like equal citizens, but that's not our problem, because our problem is of human rights. That's one thing I wanted to emphasize. Our problem is of self-determination and a real democratic process of non-colonial, non-territorial options. Number two, people that are watching this panel must understand that the statehood leadership in Puerto Rico presents a statehood as an economic transaction, not because of love or loyalty to country, but because they say, if we are a state, we're gonna receive more money, which is not necessarily true, because even though we receive $5 billion in social assistance, the US economy receives each year $64 billion on purchases of US products and services. So it is a good deal to the US economy. So when Yulin said we're not looking for handouts, well, of course not. On the contrary, we are getting handouts in all of our history. Third misconception, that Puerto Rico is going to become a democratic state. That is not true. Actually, like Yulin explained, the past administration with a democratic governor passed laws that eliminated rights for labor protections to workers, eliminated gender education in public schools, limited rights for the LGBT community, blocked legislation to protect women. If you take the main leadership of the pro-statehood party in Puerto Rico, the former governor Luis Fortuño is a Republican. The former president of the Senate in Puerto Rico, is a Republican. The former president of the House of Representatives in Puerto Rico is a Republican. And the current resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez, from Puerto Rico, so not only a Republican, she was a passionate supporter of Donald Trump. So be careful with thinking that if Puerto Rico becomes a state, it's going to be a democratic state. Now, I want to address the issue very quickly about the process. I think Puerto Rico had a process during 1989 to 1991, which was Senate Bill 712. It was promoted by Senator Bennett Johnston. It started with all political leaders in Puerto Rico asking for the Senate to provide a forum to investigate, to debate, to define different options. But at that time, first of all, 936 sections still available. The U.S. Navy is still bombing in Vieques, and they had Roosevelt Roads as a main military base outside the continental U.S. And also, we didn't have then what we have now, 3 branches of the U.S. government saying that Puerto Rico is a territory, a property of Congress, and that they lie to the U.S. Population, to the U.S. people, they lie to Puerto Ricans, and they lie to the international community. So there's now the cat is out of the bag. I mean, and I think that puts Congress with a moral, political, legally, internationally, in the international plane, with an obligation to address Puerto Rico's colonial status. And that's what I think, that's why I think that Lidia Velazquez and Alexandria Ocasio's proposal is a good start. I mean, I know that there are going to be many meetings, and probably there are going to be some kinds of oversight sessions, but certainly it's a step towards the right direction. It recognizes the problem. It's an inclusive proposal. It's a proposal that recognizes that the options to solve the problem have to be non-colonial, non-territorial, and also it put Congress in a position that they have to comply. So I think that it's a good start, and I know that we're going to be working with her in the times ahead.
Thank you, Juan. We're going to move now to Rafa.
Thank you. Yes, 3 quick points. The recent plebiscite, did it constitute a mandate for statehood? Well, even if you take the official results, which have been, publicized so much by supporters of statehood, the result was 52% for statehood, 48% against statehood. Now, 48% against statehood is not a mandate for statehood. If anything, these results indicate a very even split in the electorate according to this issue. 52 for 48 is by no means a mandate, a very clear mandate for statehood in this case. And as one said, this is 52% of the 55% who voted. So it really amounts to about 27% of the eligible voters. So there's no mandate for statehood on the basis of this recent plebiscite. Now, I understand why, and I think we should understand why many well-meaning Americans can be led to support statehood for Puerto Rico. The reasoning goes like this, goes like this. Puerto Ricans are American citizens. That's a fact. Puerto Ricans are affected by the decisions of Congress and by the decisions taken by the president. But Puerto Ricans cannot vote for Congress or for the president. They are disenfranchised. Therefore, the solution is for Puerto Rico to become a state. then Puerto Ricans would be able to vote for Congress, they would be able to vote for the president, and they would have their full rights as American citizens. Now, that is right. As far as that goes, that's correct. And that's why many people can be led to think, to conclude that the way to bring Puerto Rico out of the colonial situation is to make Puerto Rico a state. Now, the problem with that reasoning is that it ignores the fact that besides statehood, Puerto Rico has at least two other options on how to get out of the colonial situation. Yes, Puerto Rico can become a state. That's one road, that's one way. But Puerto Rico can also become independent. Or Puerto Rico can have a relationship of sovereign free association with the United States. So yes, Puerto Ricans don't have full rights. Puerto Ricans are in a colonial situation, but it's not automatic that the solution to that is statehood. There are other two options. So the question really, the question that arises at that point is, who should decide? Who should decide whether Puerto Rico becomes a state, Puerto Rico becomes independent, Puerto Rico becomes freely associated to the United States? And I think the only democratic answer to that question is that this is something for the Puerto Rican people to decide. The Puerto Rican people should decide whether Puerto Rico becomes one of these things. So progressives in the United States, people committed to democracy in the United States, should not advocate for statehood. They should advocate for a self-determination process for Puerto Rico, so that Puerto Rico can decide. It's not that we are going to advocate for statehood. We are going to advocate for the Puerto Rican people to be able to decide what they want to do. Maybe they want to be a state, or maybe not. Maybe they want to be independent. Maybe they want to be freely associated. It's for them to decide. That's what I think progressives in the United States should be advocating: self-determination for Puerto Rico. Now, what would a self-determination process look like? I think it would have basically 5 steps that I can think of, basic 5 steps, and I conclude with this. 1, the Puerto Rican people should elect a status assembly, whichever name you give it, representatives of the different status options. Congress should elect a negotiating commission, which should negotiate and collaborate with the Puerto Rico Status Assembly. 3, these two organisms, Congress and the Status Assembly, should construct, should define, should create several non-territorial, non-colonial options. Congress would then adopt through legislation, would indicate through legislation which of these non-colonial options it would be willing to enact if the Puerto Rican people voted for them. That means that Congress will have to come through and say, finally, whether they will accept Puerto Rico as a state or not, so that we know whether that's a real option or not. And then those options that Congress has accepted that it will enact, if the Puerto Rican vote for them, then they will be presented to the Puerto Rican people, and the Puerto Rican people will choose which option they want to, which road they want to go. Statehood, if that's possible; free association, if that's possible; independence, under which conditions. And that would be a self-determination process. Now, if you look at the Velazquez Ocasio-Cortez bill, you will see that it provides for steps 1 to 3. We have a status option. Congress elects or appoints a negotiating commission. The status option, the Status Assembly and the negotiating commission collaborate, and they design non-territorial, non-colonial options. But steps 4 and 5, there's a problem there, because in the bill as it is drafted, at that moment, Puerto Rican people are presented with one option. One of the options is presented to the Puerto Rican people. And if the Puerto Rican people favor that option, they support that option, then that option goes back to Congress. Back to Congress. And Congress decides if it enacts it or not, or it may not even act. So unfortunately, the bill as it is drafted is not binding. The Puerto Rican people are still presented with options that may end up not being enacted. But I think it's a good starting point. I think it's a good starting point, a very good starting point. I think it requires some amendment to fit what I think would be really necessary to make it a full self-determination process. But I think it's a good starting point, as I said, and I would introduce, as I said, I mentioned 5 steps. I think there are problems in steps 4 and 5, and they cannot, they can be amended without much difficulty, I think. So I think it's a good starting point, and we have to work from that, and I'm more than willing to participate in the process of making it fit what I think would be more appropriate for a self-determination process.
Thank you, Rafa. And now, just so people know, before we go to the last intervention from Luis Gutierrez, we started around 3:45. So we're going to take those 15 minutes so we can address the questions from the people. So we thank the panelists if they can stay 15 more minutes until 5:15 Eastern time, so we can address. There is a lot of questions. We're going to try to take the ones that you haven't answered, because you have answered a lot of questions, especially for the American public, and I think that's very important. Also, I want to give time when Luis finishes to Renata, the staff from Nidia Velazquez's office, to maybe, if she wants, address, for example, the recent comment from Rafael Bernawe, and maybe mention anything about timelines for presenting again the self-determination bill, the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act. And if there is any questions that you want to direct towards the staff of Representative Nidia Velazquez, please do so now in the Facebook chat or for any of the panelists, and we'll address them. Luis, you have the floor now, or in this case, you have the Zoom floor.
Let me turn this all back on. I want to pick up where Rafael just ended. I think it's an excellent beginning point. And I think through the process, the legislative process, my hope would be is that we would have conversations and dialogue where we could improve it. I'm certainly looking forward to that. And I know, if I know something about Nidia Velazquez, is that she wants to bring people together. She wants to use this moment in her life, in her standing in the Congress of the United States, to end colonialism in Puerto Rico. And we should work with her to get that done. Having said that, this is a wonderful opportunity, as has been addressed already here. The Congress of the United States may not be transferring all of the powers back to the people of Puerto Rico, but it transfers the process back to the people of Puerto Rico in terms of making the definitions and electing the delegates to this status assembly. And you know what's going to happen? It's kind of like, goes back to what Don Pedro Albizu Campos once said, huh? Es el momento de la suprema definición, o Yankee o Jíbaro. That's what's going to happen at this convention. Why do I say that? Because you're going to have Puerto Ricanistas and you're going to have Assimilistas. And whether we have a, how would I say that? A pact of friendship and solidarity between the people of Puerto Rico and the people of the United States, or full independence, they will both be republics in every sense of the word in terms of our international standing. And either one of the two can end the relationship at any point. And that really is about sovereignty. What I would also suggest is, as Rafael just said, that there could be amendments. Rafael, I'd like to see one other amendment. I'd like to see the amendment that forces the statehooders to explain to us how statehood eliminates poverty in Puerto Rico, how statehood creates jobs in Puerto Rico, how statehood crushes the dependency that exists in Puerto Rico. Because you know what? It doesn't, and they don't have an answer for it. The fact is 1 in 7 Americans will go hungry tonight. There are 40 million Americans that don't have health care. There are tens of millions of Americans who live in poverty today in the United States of America. 1 in 4 Puerto Ricans, and they like to say, well, you know, they travel with their feet. They want to go and live statehood. Really? 1 in 4 Puerto Ricans in the United States of America lives in extreme poverty. So please explain to me how Puerto Rico, that has half the per capita income of the poorest state, Mississippi, and if Mississippi, that's been a state for over 100 years, hasn't been able to resolve its social economic with their equality, makes you think? Because colonialism also has another impact, apart from political, apart from economic. You know what it is? The colonial mentality that it creates, the crushing of your self-esteem, and your lack of thinking that you are enough. That you are enough. If there is one thing I inculcated in both of my daughters every day, that they were enough. But that's not what the superstructure of the society in Puerto Rico does. It keeps telling us we're not enough. So I want to work with Nidia. I want to see that assembly in which we all come. And you know why? Because I also want, finally, for the independentistas to roll out their plan. A plan that says, hey, here's how we're going to give everybody healthcare, quality healthcare. Here's how we're going to make sure, regardless of how much money your parents make, every child's going to get an excellent education. And here's how we're going to create an economic boom of jobs of the island of Puerto Rico, where we take our talent. I can't wait. But you want to know something? So will those in the Free Association. And let's have that debate. Everybody's got to tell us how it is they're going to unfurl their option once it becomes a reality of the people of Puerto Rico. And lastly, you cannot have equality if you don't have equality of resources to express those options before and educate the people of Puerto Rico about your options. Lastly, to all the people in the United States of America, remember, the Statehood Party in Puerto Rico is a homophobic party that has a former president that used homophobic language to denounce one of his opponents. It is a party that has racists in it, like Luis Davila Colón. I mean, Luis Davila Colón got fired from Univision. And then what does he do? He gets a recognition by the state legislature after he used the N-word. We have, I mean, homophobic. Has anybody ever read the chat of the governor, Ricky Rosselló, and others? I mean, this is a party that when you look at it in Puerto Rico, is not a party that stands up to the principles of democracy and of freedom, right? And of equality for gay people, for Black people, for women in this society. It is not that kind of a party. And you don't want that kind of a party in charge of the future of Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis.
Luis, we want to know how you really feel about it.
Thank you so much. And now I want, as we go to the Q&A session, you can all jump in at, one at a time. But before that, two things. One, we have a great audience today, so that's great. Among the people that we're seeing, because they commented, there was Zaira Conde, who ran as candidate for resident commissioner. And if you want to address, she just made a comment about that Puerto Rico voted for statehood. So if you want that is something that you can address, now as we go to the Q&A, but we have many other questions that are, I think, more important than that one. But I want to give the opportunity to Renata Beca, staff at the office of Congresswoman Nidia Velazquez, to maybe address just briefly some of the comments that you heard here, especially the ones regarding the opportunity for amendments of the Puerto Rico self-determination bill, and anything that you can mention regarding the timeline, or if you know that there's going to be public hearings on this bill. Renata. I think you're muted, Renata. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Edil, and thank you everyone for being here. On behalf of the Congresswoman, she's sorry she couldn't be here, but as Edil said, she has a very, very busy schedule these days. Just to clarify, I am senior counsel for Congresswoman Nidia Velazquez. I am an attorney by training, UPR Law School proud graduate. I have been charged with dealing with the self-determination bill for the last year and a half. I've been immersed in this edit process for the last 4 months intensely. I have been dealing with the groups, and many of you are aware. In terms of amendments and edits and timeline, we are currently still making some tweaks to the language. We've addressed some of the feedback that Senator Bernawe has mentioned. We are still working back and forth with Legislative Council. So they're still in the draft process. Once the bill is introduced, then there will be opportunity for amendments and hearings and markup, etc. In terms of timeline, we expect that by the end of the month, this bill will be reintroduced. I will keep the date close to my heart, but it's a nonstop process of working with all of those who have provided feedback, and with now the new progressive members of the House. We've been doing a lot of staff meetings, educating my fellow staffers on what this bill means and all the procedural questions. And as all of the panelists have shared, I want to clarify that statehood is included as part of the status convention. So statehooders will get a seat at the table to discuss statehood and its accompanying transition plan. So they are not excluded. This is an inclusive process, a democratic process, and a transparent process.
Thank you so much, Renata, and thank you for that clarification. And also, and I mentioned that at the beginning of the of this panel, we did invite pro-statehooders to this panel, and they're always welcome. They decided to decline and not participate, some of them because they wanted to have the saying on how the panel had to be organized and everything. So just to make also that clear. So let's go to some of the questions that we have here. We have one that is repeated, and we have millions of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora. We ourselves are an advocacy group. So we want to know, what concrete actions can the Puerto Ricans in the diaspora do to support the decolonization of Puerto Rico? So, Yulín, you can jump first.
Now, number one, you can lobby alongside Congresswoman. Oh, sorry. You can lobby alongside Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez and Ocasio-Cortez, and make sure that people understand that this is something that needs to be settled. So whether it is emailing, texting, sending notes via Facebook or Twitter, it is important that members of Congress, that, we are competing within a very complicated agenda. The Biden-Harris administration has a lot of work to do to undo the wrongs and the injustices of the Trump era. So we have to make sure that they understand that part of that undoing and rerouting to a new democratic level is ending the crime of colonialism. That's number one. Number two is to make sure, like tonight, when this is over, make sure that you engage in social media, Twitter, Facebook, and hashtag, add your committee, because it is very important. Sometimes, and I know Juan and Rafa and Luis have said this many times, but sometimes we tend to think that the discussion of status is a philosophical and political mind status. Status has an impact on everything we do. We wake up in the morning, we listen to a radio station that is controlled by the FCC. We brush our teeth with toothbrushes and toothpastes that are controlled by the FDA. We drink our coffee, and the pesticides and herbicides that are used in our coffee are also controlled by the FDA. We drive in a car, which we can only buy cars that are approved or pre-approved by the EPA, and so on and on and on and on. And by the time we go to sleep, our entire life has been really un espejismo. I don't know how to say that in English. It's a dread. a mirage of what a decision-making of people truly is like. And one last thing I wanted to mention, when Luis Gutierrez was mentioning about giving healthcare for all, and education for all, and making sure that people got what they needed, aren't those American values? Aren't those at the core of what these new America should look like? Isn't that why in Congress they're talking about $15 an hour? Hell, I want Puerto Ricans to make $15 an hour. So, Congress should also look at saying, with all those $1.3 trillion that are going down to Puerto Rico, which were held up by the Trump administration, every job, direct or indirect, that comes out of that money should be $15 an hour. Because there are things that we can begin doing right now that will lower the inequality that is intrinsic in a colonialist relationship.
I'd like to just take a moment and say I agree with Carmen Julín. You need to talk to your representatives. I have really been blessed with what a wonderful life. When I came to Puerto Rico in 1971, I felt that I was Puerto Rican. I knew in my heart I was Puerto Rican. And the only group of people that accepted my Puerto Ricanness in its totality were independentistas. I know that sounds so ironic that a kid who could not speak Spanish find Puerto Rico on a map because they saw me as returning, right? Del destierro, that my mom and dad had to leave, as nearly 1 million Puerto Ricans had to leave. So for all of you that have been in the United States of America, living statehood, as they say, when you've really been living in a free, independent, sovereign nation, I say to you the following. In 1974, we filled Madison Square Garden. Let me repeat that. In 1974, we filled Madison Square Garden. Let's work once again collectively in Chicago. And yes, in Massachusetts, in New York, in Orlando, in Tampa, in all across this country. And let's all fight for the self-determination of the people of Puerto Rico and support Nidia Velazquez bill. Because you hear the four of us here, please note there are no asimilistas, anexionistas on this call, because they don't want to be on this call. For them, it's a fait accompli, it's statehood or nothing. We want to work with the Congress of the United States, who will have a bilateral commission that will work in unison, not dictate, but work in unison and advise the Constitution, the Status Assembly. And let's all work. And I would say to Nidia Velazquez and to Ocasio-Cortez, the one thing you two could do is come to Puerto Rico. I know you might have to wait a while as we deal with this pandemic, but when you come to Puerto Rico, I assure you, we will receive you with open arms. So let's do it again at Madison Square Garden, and please, que esas dos boricuas vengan aquí a la nación puertorriqueña a traernos nuestra libertad y adelantar el final del colonialismo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis.
If I may jump in, well, after
one, yeah, and then Rafa.
I'm gonna be brief. First of all, I don't want to oversimplify, but first of all, you can educate yourself and educate others about the issue of the colonial problem existing in Puerto Rico and the consequences of it. Secondly, you can organize or become part of organizations that are very active in the Boricua diaspora, and that they can have initiatives that educate other people, and they can call people in Congress and outside Congress. I mean, we have to make our voice heard, because for years, the pro-statehood leadership has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars of Puerto Rican taxpayers to make misrepresentations of what the people of Puerto Rico think, what they really are as a nation and as a people. And we have to fight that in every space that we get the chance to raise our voice and educate and organize and call
Julene is right. Call your Congress representative, email those Congress representatives, make the problem of Puerto Rico colonial status, make it part of the agenda by raising your voice. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Rafa.
Yeah, very rapidly. I just want to say two things. One of them is it's very important for me for people in the United States, particularly non-Puerto Ricans in the United States, progressive people, and Americans in general, to understand that those of us who are for independence of Puerto Rico do not have this position out of hatred or antagonism to the American people, not at all. The independence that I fight for, the independent Puerto Rico that I want, is a Puerto Rico which would be a Puerto Rico characterized by social justice, by an economy that serves the people. Now, such a Puerto Rico cannot be constructed in isolation. It has to be constructed in collaboration with other countries, with other peoples. So for me, the advancement of progressive social struggles in the United States is absolutely fundamental for the type of Puerto Rico that I want. Puerto Rico, the independent Puerto Rico that I want, needs for progressive forces in the United States to become stronger, to be able to change American society. So I see my struggle for Puerto Rican independence as part of linked to progressive struggles in the United States. And my request would be, or my suggestion would be, that anybody and everybody who is involved in any sort of struggle in the United States, to make sure that in your agenda, in your demands, in your presentations before Congress, before any institution, to make sure that you include the demand for Puerto Rico's right to self-determination. You know, we want this for the environment. We want this measure for workers. We want this measure for women. We want these measures to defund the police and so on and so forth. And for Puerto Rico, which has to be part of a progressive agenda, we demand a process of self-determination to make sure that all movements in the United States, labor movement, women's movement, African Americans, immigration right movements, environmental movement, and so on and so forth, include within their agenda the fact that there is a colony and that it needs to have a process of self-determination. And as the person who works in, I didn't catch her name, who works with Nidia Velazquez said, we want a process in which everybody is included, not only independentistas, not only defenders of free association, but also defenders of statehood. All options should be on the table. We need to exclude, if it's a decolonization process, by definition, we have to exclude the colonial options, the territorial options. We want non-territorial, non-colonial options. Those are the ones who are going to be part of the process. So that would be my request for everybody and everybody who is active in some sort of movement, to make sure that Puerto Rico and the demands and the need for Puerto Rican self-determination is part of that agenda, is visible within that progressive agenda in the United States.
Thank you, Rafa. We have many questions. There's going to be time for maybe one or two more questions, and then I want to give also the opportunity to each one of the panelists to end with 30 seconds reflection of the most important thing, the most important takeaway for the people from this. But one question for Renata, and I don't know if Luis Gutierrez wants to jump in also. Any opportunity that some members of the US Senate will present a bill similar to the one from Velazquez Ocasio?
Yes, there will be an opportunity. There are conversations over with my Senate colleagues. They're still private, but yes, there is movement in the Senate as of right now. And if I just may add to what Senator Bernawe said, I think that is the message. When it comes to Puerto Rican status, self-determination is the progressive position. And I think that is the message. And I think members of Congress need to be educated, their staffers need to be educated, but also I invite my fellow diasporicans to call their state representatives. So in turn, those state representatives get in contact with their members of Congress, that this bill, it's the progressive position when it comes to Puerto Rico status.
Thank you. Okay, so maybe time for two more quick questions and then we close. And then I just want to mention also, and I think Juan mentioned that there is an opportunity with a lot of advocacy groups like our group, Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora. We are going to be doing call to actions. We have toolkits where we have all of the information, the Twitter handles, the emails from all of the offices, and we have the messaging, and we want to do Twitter blasts and Twitter storms and everything like that in the coming weeks. So please be on the lookout for that. So there is a very good question here, a little bit long, from Alberto Medina, a question regarding messaging about that the plebiscite results and strategies for moving forward. The argument that decisions are made by those who show up is very persuasive to many Americans who are used to low turnout midterm and local elections. In addition, as independentistas, we argue that the status quo was wrong when it enjoyed a strong majority support, and that statehood will be wrong even if it enjoys strong majority support. So the question, how can we make the case against statehood and for independence to an American audience on moral and political grounds without getting distracted by playing with the numbers? I don't know if someone wants to like get into this question.
Well, if I may, rather briefly, Bernawe here.
Yes, Rafa.
Yes. Well, I think it's a question that we could spend a lot of time arguing about. But I think we have to divide our message in two ways. I think I am a supporter of independence, but it seems to me that our emphasis at this stage is not trying to get the people in the United States to support independence. That is a job that we independentistas in Puerto Rico and in the United States, that's our job. My job as an independentista is to explain and to convince the Puerto Rican people that independence is the best option. We have to work on that. But it seems to me that the main element right now regarding the American people is not to convince them they should support independence. They support the process of self-determination. And of course, in the process of doing that, those of us who are independentistas will also explain why we think independence is the best option. But right now, I think that I would say that the emphasis should be, I think I may be wrong on this. I don't live in the United States, but I think there's a widespread notion among many people in the United States, well-meaning people, I think, that yes, Puerto Rico is a colony, it should become a state, just like Washington, D.C. There's an analogy, you know, Washington D.C. is in this inferior situation, it should become a state. Same thing with Puerto Rico. And that's a false analogy. And I think our job right now is to emphasize that's a false analogy. Puerto Rico has more than one option. It should be able to have a process which is binding and in which it's able to decide what it wants to do. And I would emphasize that angle. As I said, the recent plebiscite, I find it very hard for anybody to think that this is a very strong mandate for anything. You know, a 52-48% process in which there was only one option. Only one of the political parties was in favor of holding this plebiscite. It is not binding. If you look at the wording, let me say this final detail. You look at the wording of the plebiscite. The people of Puerto Rico supposedly voted for Puerto Rico to immediately become a state of the United States. Well, if this was right, then Puerto Rico should be on its way to becoming a state. But it so happens that that's not the case. Now we are supposed to elect some of the people. We are supposed to elect a committee that's going to go to Congress. We are supposed to hold perhaps another plebiscite in order to ratify what was already decided. So it was evidently not what the people were told they were voting for. So there are many problems with this plebiscite that was just held. We opposed this plebiscite before it was held. We are not criticizing it because we didn't like the results. We were against it from the beginning, from before the beginning. So And I am sure that it's going to result in nothing. We have had 5 plebiscites. Not one of them was binding. The results of all of them was nothing, zero, nada came out of them, and nada is going to come out of this one until we have a participatory, transparent, binding process in which Congress participates. We are not going to solve this problem.
Thank you, Rafa. Julie.
Edil, I think it's time also for the well-intentioned American people to look within. These words are etched in most of the soul of the American people. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and we have to add women, are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Does that mean that the creator only meant that for people that are Americans? Or isn't it time to make the promise of that a reality, doing the only progressive and right thing, which is giving Puerto Ricans, giving the nation of Puerto Rico the right that the creator gives us to the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness? So you see, the time for double discourse in the United States must reach an end, not only by voting out Donald Trump, but by also looking within the American society. If it is true that we are all endowed by the creator to those 3 things, then it is true that anything and any process that enables that should be unleashed without any reservation. I often say, and I am misinterpreted in Puerto Rico, that I like so much the basic democratic principles of the United States that I want them for my country. So if we are going to say that we are progressive, if we are going to say that we respect civil and human rights, then we ought, it is an imperative to walk the talk and not only read those words in some fancy documents to be repeated, but live those words. And I think that Nidia Velazquez and Ocasio-Cortez's bill, it's a bill where actions meet purpose. Actions meet purpose. What is the purpose? The purpose is to end with something that is a criminal act under international law. Because of colonization, we are denied access to basic services, and denying access to basic services is a crime under international law. So I think it is, the time is now, and Jennifer Lopez said it when she sang in the inauguration of Joe Biden, let's get loud. Let's get loud.
Thank you, Julene. Juan, if you want to jump in, and then we'll have 30 seconds for each one of the panelists to just wrap up.
I just wanted to add 2 things. First, for the moral stand ground of the narrative and the argument for self-determination and independence and sovereignty for Puerto Rico. I think from an American standpoint or point of view, you have the history of the United States, of those values, and those values rejected through that history towards other peoples, other minorities, and in Puerto Rico, being a nation intervened by military action for more than 122 years, it's time for the United States Congress to make things right. Julene said earlier, as did Luis Gutierrez, part of those things that were consequences of a colonial policy towards Puerto Rico, damaging socially, humanly, physically, Puerto Ricans, our environment, our economy, and this is a time to address what it is since the 90s in the last century, in the 20th century, was declared a crime against humanity, which is colonialism by the United Nations. So that's from a moral standpoint, but I wouldn't take the argument about numbers as a distraction, because even though that people say that in the United States, those who show up are the ones who decide, the truth is that also in Congress, they are aware that electoral participation in Puerto Rico is very high. So when the New Progressive Party celebrated the referendum in 2017, they went to Congress and said that they got 97% of approval for statehood. Actually, the rest of the political parties and other people and parties that represented other options boycotted that referendum, that plebiscite. So Congress was aware that only 23% of active voters voted in that plebiscite. So it wasn't a credible result. And I think that that's an argument, because it also deconstructs the narrative of the statehooders, that in Puerto Rico, people are screaming for statehood. They want to assimilate to the United States, which is not true. And that's an argument that needs to be addressed also, to show the people in the United States, but also in Congress, that the narrative that the statehooders are using is false, plain and simple. And we have to call them on that.
Thank you, Juan. So we have so many questions. So what we're gonna do, because we have to wrap up, is we're gonna go back tonight to see all of these questions on the chat, and we'll try to address them. We'll try to answer them. So be in the lookout. Also, I welcome if Yulín, Juan, Rafa, Luis, Renata can also want to take a look and also answer them. That will be great. Luis had to go, but I think Luis mentioned something so important. He mentioned two call to actions. One, to try to fill again the Madison Square Garden as it was done in the 70s. At that time, it was the Puerto Rico Solidarity rally in the Madison Square Garden. More than 20,000 people for Puerto Rico there, and it included the maximum figures of the civil rights movement of the United States. Angela Davis, Ella Baker, many others were there in solidarity with Puerto Rico. So I think that's something we can work. And also, it will be great if we can see Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Nidia Velazquez going to Puerto Rico, and not only them, Renata, try to bring also these new progressive Congress people, Cory Bush from St. Louis, Mondaire Jones, Ilan Omar. We do know that we can work hand in hand with the progressives here in the U.S. to try to finally decolonize Puerto Rico. So I want to offer 30 seconds reflection, just the last remarks, the takeaway for each one of the panelists. We can start with Rafa. We're gonna leave Yulín to the end because you started. So Rafa, you can start.
So yes, very rapidly. While I have spoken very strongly in favor of independence during the conversation today, I would like to indicate that the movement that I belong to, Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, also includes people who are supporters of statehood. One of my fellow legislators in the House of Representatives in Puerto Rico, recently elected, is Jose Bernardo Marquez. I work very closely with him on a daily basis. He's a supporter of statehood. So it's a sort of demonstration that people who support independence, statehood, different status options can work together. Even though we disagree on what status option we prefer, we agree that we need a process of self-determination, and we can work together in that direction. And just to indicate that, my office in the capital in San Juan, we are working there every day, and we are more than happy to have contact with any of you by whichever means, so we can keep this conversation open, which has been tremendous. I really am glad I participated, and I thank again the organizers for inviting me.
Thank you, Rafa. Juan, some last words?
Yes, first I want to commend you and the organizers for this initiative. I think it is part of something bigger that is going to be going on towards the future about Puerto Rico self-determination process, the bill and the initiative of Velazquez and Alexandre Ocasio. And I only wanted to say that the U.S. has a lot to address towards the future after the past 4 years, but even before that. And I think that Puerto Rico is a litmus test of how the United States government is going to deal with Latin America and the rest of the world. You cannot talk internationally about being a democratic champion and then having a colony, which is the antithesis of what is democracy. So I think this is an urgent subject, and then again I commend you with this opportunity with this great panel, Julien, Rafa, Luis, Renata. Hope we do this again.
We are more than happy for doing this again. So maybe this is something that we can do, once each 2-3 months or something like that. I know that, this is something that hopefully is very useful for the American public and also for the staffers in Congress. So, Julien, you have the last word, and with your reflection, we are closing the panel.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for having the opportunity to share in this conversation. It is a continuous dialogue that will provide us a path moving forward. And secondly, I want to thank Lidia Velazquez and Alexandria Ocasio for putting the progressive back into the agenda when it comes in terms of the Puerto Rican political status. And thirdly, I want to say that the time is now. I believe in some way, which I will paraphrase, Martin Luther King would say, it's never a bad time to do the right thing. And John Lewis would say, we ought to get in the right kind of trouble. When something is wrong, we have only two options. We either stand up and speak up, or we stand down and become complicit to a certain rules and regulations which are undermining our ability to pursue the best version of ourselves. I believe that the American people are well-intentioned. I believe that we have an opportunity now as Puerto Ricans to interject into that new agenda. I believe, as Rafa Bernawe, that there are very many well-intentioned Americans, and as Juan Dalmau, that it is a moral imperative that will help the United States tell the world that they mean business, that they are serious about coming to a reckoning which will be different from the past. But I also wanted to let everybody know that I accepted a distinguished fellow position with Mount Holyoke College, and I'll be a distinguished fellow in leadership there at their Weizmann Center. And Holyoke, Massachusetts has about 60% of its population is Puerto Rican. So when you put a Holyoke, Amherst, South Hadley, and Connecticut, which is about 40 minutes away, I think it's high time that we did a local chapter of Boricuas Unidos en la Diaspora in Holyoke / South Hadley. So I'll be getting in touch with you, Adi, to push that forward.
We'll do that. Thank you again. We took so much time, and I if it was for me, I will stay here like 1 more hour and address all of these questions. But this means that we have to continue, as Julien said, we have to continue with these dialogues. This is a continuous dialogue. So hopefully you have taken some good feedback for everyone that is joining today, and have a good day. And we're going to continue doing this hopefully on a regular basis, and count with us, you know, for the advocacy efforts. We're going to be pushing Congress. We're going to be pushing Congress to address these problems, but especially address the colonial problem of Puerto Rico. Thank you. Good night, and we'll continue doing this work.